I am 76 years old. That's older than dirt, but younger than Mike Cook. So let's keep everything in perspective here. I respect my elders, and I won't say anything about Mike. Two, I arrived here in a Ford. We won't go any further than that. But I did want you to know that I don't worry too much about whether I get out of here before dark. I don't think my Ford's got any Rufus Electrics, but then again, we'll never know. Three, I am, as you know from my background, primarily oriented towards the BMC side of the business, which was MG and Austin Healey and Morris and Nuffield Tractors and a lot of other things. Although I did start out with Triumph, the Triumph ad agency. But I'm sure, like a lot of you who are involved with British cars, somehow or another you come to a point in your life or a point in your road, or as you know that wonderful philosopher Yogi Berra said, you come to a fork in the road. And when you come to that fork in the road, well, you take it. And my fork led right, and I ended up more inclined to Abingdon than I was towards Canley and Speke and some of those other unspeakable places where they tried to build Triumphs. So my background is primarily with MG in the earlier times, and later, of course, getting into Jaguar. But that still doesn't mean that I don't know a little bit about the company, because out of college I went into the Army, and in typical fashion, you know, I had no science and no math when I was in college. Well, I did have science. I had biology and geography, but no real science. So needless to say, the military, in its infinite wisdom, decided I would be perfect in missiles and electronics. So they sent me to a 17-week course in El Paso, Texas, in full blitz. If you know anything about the military, anything with F-O-R-T in front of it is always pronounced faux. So there's faux blitz, faux bending, various assorted places. Well, that's where I was sent for basic training, or basic officer training. And I think of the 17 weeks that I was down there, I probably spent about 15 on academic probation. But I did get through, and did get my bars, my bar as a lieutenant. And somehow or another, in one of the rare times when it does work, somebody went through my entire file and found out of the 17 weeks, I had spent 4 relatively productive days in motors and generators. So after I graduated, they assigned me to Fort Bliss, and I was in charge the next day of about $4 million worth of motors and generators, which were used to power high-altitude missile equipment, of which I knew very little about. But I think the reason they picked me was because of all the courses that I took. This is one of the few that I passed with, I wouldn't have said flying colors, but at least they were sort of hanging limply. And consequently, I got my experience there. And I think it turned out to be a relatively good experience for my quote-unquote career, which followed after that. I spent 2 years at Foblis, and got out and came out and started looking for a job which required really no experience and not a lot of specialization. So I interviewed with companies, or started to interview with companies, advertising agencies, starting with NW Air at the top of the list alphabetically, and then it went straight through Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner, and Bean in those days, now it's Smith, and ending up with UP, United Parcel. But my first interview was with NW Air in Philadelphia. Still there, but now headquartered in New York, I think. Very impressive building. And I went in and interviewed, and apparently did reasonably well, so I was then carried to the next step. And I was introduced to a gentleman by the name of Ted Whittlesley. Now that's close to 50 years ago, but I still remember Ted, because he gave me a little bit of advice that turned out to be rather useful. He said, if you're going into advertising, you really should know a little bit about it. So I thought that's probably a reasonable thing to expect. And he advised that I read a book about NWA that had just been put together by Harvard. And consequently, before my next interview, I did get this book and read through it very quickly and went for my second interview. And my second interview was with an agency called Benton & Bowles. Unfortunately, they required that I do a psychological test before then. And as I pointed out to the lady, if I wasn't psycho before I took the test, I certainly was when I finished it. That, of course, included the interview as well. The next interview was with an agency called Doherty Clifford Steers in Shenfield. And as I was sitting there and waiting to be interviewed by the account man who was responsible for sort of grooming the new young people in there, there was a magazine on the desk next to me called Printers Ink. It's no longer in publication, so don't even look for it, but it was very, very useful because they had an article in there by a young man who was an account man himself, and they asked him why he went into advertising. And he said, well, he said he liked the idea of the freedom that it gave you. Freedom to think out of the box, long before that expression was in common usage. And the imagination and the initiative, and it was self-driven, and so went through this whole long list of things. So the concluding part of it, while you could even wear a yellow shirt or a pink shirt, you weren't required to wear a white shirt, as of course you were with all of the other companies in those good old days. So when I interviewed with the account man, I noticed that he was wearing a yellow shirt. We had instantaneous rapport, and I could go back on it, the fact that you could do this. And so I ended up with a job at Doherty Clifford Steers in Shenfield, in the mailroom. And one of the things that I learned to do was to find my way to 1745 Broadway, which was then the headquarters of the Standard Triumph Motor Company. And my cook was already working there, and obviously I delivered mail to him, delivered mail to other people within the company. And that was my job for about 6 months until they finally decided I had to do something a little bit more productive. And I was offered some opportunities and took one in the public relations department of the agency. And as the bio would say, I mean, I had the Peter Gunn show, started working on it. When I joined the PR department, it was 14 people. When I left 4 years later, we were down to about 4. So through attrition, rather than through intelligence, I ended up doing a lot of things, you know, within the PR area, if you will. I had 3 regional breweries. They were my first love. I enjoyed doing that. And one of the accounts was the Standard Triumph Motor Company. Deviating slightly from the bio, I became more and more involved. One of the first jobs I had to do as a PR job was to deliver press kits to a young man who was racing Triumphs at the time. And he had come up with this very good idea of going around to the various Triumph dealers in the area and saying that if they would sponsor him, he would put their names on the side of his car. And he was a relatively successful driver. So it was my job to bring the press kits to where he was having a meeting with people like you, people who were part of the Triumph Club, with dealers and so on and so forth. And that was my introduction to a gentleman by the name of Mr. Robert C. Tullius, whose name I'm sure you all know. And I'm happy to say that Bob was even older than I am. It's alive and well in Sebring, Florida. It's got an incredible, incredible operation down there. If you have a chance, see if you can drop in on his hangar, where he's got some of his plane storage. He's still got some of the historic cars, but it's everything that you've ever heard of about Bob Tullius. I mean, literally, when they say you could eat off the floor, you can eat off the floor. It's immaculate. And that's the way Bob always ran his team. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why he was so successful. Okay, from some of the other Triumph stories, I remember that we had we were constantly getting a new succession of management coming through from the UK. There was a gentleman by the name of Martin Tustin, who was president at about that time. That would put it in the mid-70s. Sorry, mid-60s. And Martin Tustin came in, and he was probably typical British management of that time. He had obviously been assigned to the United States. He was not terribly thrilled with being with us, but nevertheless he had to go through that tour of duty, if you will, with the foreigners before he could move up in the echelons of Triumph at the time. And so it fell to us to introduce Martin to the press, which we did not too far away from here, in a place called Shawnee on the Delaware, which I think it still exists, does it? Yeah. Okay, okay. So we had press people there, and of course the press were very American. Martin was very British, so immediately we sort of had that kind of friction, if you will, between the two. And one of the people that we had there was a gentleman by the name of Andy Hendry. He was with the Westchester group of newspapers. And for reasons known only to Andy and Martin, they got into a discussion about how tall people were. Now, why, I have no idea. But it was that kind of thing, as I'm standing there trying to referee, I knew it was not going to end well. Because I'm not exactly tall, but I looked down at Martin. So finally, at one point during the course of the conversation, Andy turned to Martin, and even though Andy was from the Westchester group of newspapers, he tended to be more of a New Englander. So there's that sort of New England accent. And he said, Martin, just how tall are you, Martin? And there was Martin, who was trying to, almost standing on his toes. He said, well, I'm 5'8". And I'm looking at him, looking down at him, knowing there was no way he was 5'8". But on the other side, knowing there was no way we were going to get out of this gracefully either. And we didn't. Fortunately, dinner was cold, I think, and that put an end to that. But part of my job being there on this press thing was to try and get the press to write good things about the company. And we had an editor from the World Telegram and Sun by the name of Charlie Sievert, long gone now. Charlie had a tendency in his older age to play cards and probably drink a little bit too much. So it was my job to make sure that at least Charlie, before he totally became non-compos mentis, that at least he had put out something productive about Triumph. And so I was watching him very, very carefully and kept trying to get Charlie back to his room so he could write his story. And I finally said, Charlie, you know, it's about 9 o'clock. He had a great hand and a great bottle. He wasn't going to leave. So he finally just kind of waved to me and said, you do it. So I had his bio on the next story, but it worked out very successfully. And I think that was kind of how the nature of the business was in those days. There's a phrase that I heard many years ago. It's called cognitive dissonance. And if you don't know what cognitive dissonance is, it was really sort of, I think, came up from a psychologist looking at veterans and how veterans tended to remember only the things that were humorous about wartime experiences and to bury all the wartime experiences. And the psychologists and psychiatrists concluded this was sort of a defense mechanism. And I think to a certain extent I suffered from cognitive dissonance. I have to remind myself on occasion that we had an awful lot of fun at that time, but it was a lot of hard work. And there were not very many people doing it, and not a lot of people being paid any money to do it. So bear in mind, as I try to tell some of the humorous sides of the business, that we had to take it relatively serious at times too. And consequently, it meant that few people were doing quite a few jobs. Okay, that takes me up some of the other cars that I was involved in. Introducing, I'm sure we all remember the Triumph Herald. I don't know if you knew this, but the Triumph Herald was constructed, well, you probably know it better than I do. it was bolt-on construction, they called it. And one of the ways they introduced this car was to bring the frame out at meetings. And a team of 4, Mike Cook was one of them, would bolt this car together right in front of everybody. And they could get the thing, I think they got it down, if Mike was correct, something like 4 minutes they were able to bolt it together, which was a great achievement, except that there was a distributor at the time who, having been to one of these meetings, took one look at it and said, yeah, it'll come as part just as quick. But it's, you know, a car maybe ahead of its time, I don't know. We had the Herald, and we had the 1250, the Vitesse, the Sport 6, then a Triumph Stag, of course the TR4, 4A. Stag was one of my favorite cars to drive. I really enjoyed driving it. And I think, you know, sadly, it never really developed a good sales picture in the United States. But there again, that was a problem, I think, of the people that were marketing it. So, that carries me through to 1964. I was then recruited by the then British Motor Corporation to go work on the other side, to work on the client side, and to work on all those other British cars that I need not mention again. And that kind of evolved. Then we merged with Triumph. I think the British had an idea that if you took 1 or 2 one-legged men and put them together, that somehow or another you would end up with a 2-legged man. And of course what you ended up was each of them falling over each other. And then they compounded that by adding Jaguar. So we now have 3 one-legged men, you know, trying to prop each other up. And of course the result was British Leyland. There's not much that we can say about British Leyland other than the kitchen cabinet blue, as we called it, of the British Leyland logo, which was known internally as the reverse whirling a-hole. But it was a company that was just, you know, I think probably hampered as much by its management as its management allowed it to either grow or dissolve. Eventually, by 1979, we were down to Jaguar, and I had a chance to go over to Doyle Day and Bernbach to work on Porsche and Audi, and thought to myself, hey, there are, you know, we could fill Shea Stadium with all the people who would want to work on that account at that particular agency. So I took advantage of it and moved over there, and I was there for 3 years until that business moved west to Detroit under Volkswagen. And I moved over to Ammirati and Pierce on BMW, the ultimate driving machine. Ammirati and Pierce had created that. The account was going like gangbusters, and it was a chance to work on, again, a really great German brand, and to watch it grow and to be a part of all of that. I had a chance also to drive some really neat cars. 928s, 911s, 944 was introduction that I'm probably the most proud of in my career. We were working with one of the great people in the business, Jim Fuller, who was then the director of the Porsche and Audi division at Volkswagen. Jim was one of the great car people I've met in my life. Unfortunately, Jim was killed in Pontiac 103 that went down over Lockerbie. One of the two executives from Porsche and Audi in the United States who were on that flight. And I think at that point in time, the industry lost one of its greats. I was fortunate enough to know Bob Sinclair at Saab, I think another one of the industry greats, and my ex-boss, Mike Dale, who ran Jaguar, and ran it very successfully until we encountered a blue oval that kind of ran over us. Anyhow, it ran over me, that's for sure. I had 6 years with Jaguar, 4 of the best in my life. As a marketing man, there was absolutely nothing more exciting to be involved in a product launch. And to have a feeling that you were part of that product, to contribute to the development of it, to contribute to the way it's put together, to contribute to the way it's presented to the marketplace. And I think it was the best 4 years of my life, and followed by probably the worst too. Not that Ford wasn't a good manager, but there was just an entirely different view of what the marketplace was all about. And consequently, they were going to win, and I certainly wasn't, and I didn't, and I left, or was fired actually, after being with them for 6 years. And following that, I went back, in a sense, to work with BMW. I worked with the media buying agency. At that time, Amorati and Puris had lost the account. BMW decided, for reasons known best to themselves, to separate the creative and the media, and I ended up working on the media portion of the account, which was very, very good, because I was also working with the dealers, and I enjoyed doing that. And not very many people from the manufacturer, or from the marketing side, from the executive side, really understood the dealers and their needs. But really through the tutelage of people like Bob Sinclair and Jim Fuller and Mike Dale, I began to appreciate their role in the mix. From people who are outside, it's not always that easy to see it. But bear in mind, in those days, they were essentially the people who were putting the money where the mouth is. We, as part of the factory, we were getting paid. You know, our salaries came, our salary checks came through. Maybe not as large as we would like them to have been, but they came through every 2 weeks. But those are the guys who were really putting the money out there to help build the franchise. So many of them were very good, and many of them, thank goodness, are still in business. But they were the entrepreneurial people that drove many of these products to successes in the marketplace. I sort of deliberately avoided mentioning too much about the TR7. How many of you have read this book by David Knowles? 1? Oh, good. 2. All right. I was about ready to quit there if anybody had read it. It's really a very great book, and I was rereading parts of it to just sort of refresh my memory about the way things were going. And I read about a visit to Speak, and I kept reading it. I said, this is very good. Hey, that's my story he's doing. And the worst part about it, he was doing a very much better job telling my story than I ever could. But essentially, if you want to know what the problem with the TR7 was, aside from the fact that really there were a lot of bits and pieces in it that were never intended to be in there, but simply because of the compromise that they had to make, they had to pull it essentially out of the parts bins of the various component companies. One of the things that used to irritate me the most was the drip rail, you know, that goes around the pillars, A pillar or around to the C pillar, whatever you want to call it, on TR7. It never seemed to fit. It was covered by a rubber covering, and it never seemed to fit properly. It was always either very short in the front or very short in the back, or it was short front and back. So one of my trips to England, I think we were probably doing the photography for that Leyland and British Racing Green. I made a side trip to Speak, which is the factory located in Liverpool, England. And I went through Speak. They assigned a young engineer to go around with me. I called him my minder. And I think his job was essentially to keep me out of areas where I shouldn't be in, and hopefully to not see things I probably shouldn't have seen. And he was taking me around, and he came to, an area, and he showed me a pressing for the front end of the car, which they called Nessie, after the Loch Ness Monster. And that's because of the really strange shape of this whole thing. And he looked at me very proudly, and he said, "This is the most complicated pressing in the European automotive industry at this time. And I look back at him and I said, we don't even do simple very well, much less complicated. And he never quite understood that. But I think essentially that was the problem. He finally left me because he had to go to a meeting or something like that. And I got to the area on the assembly line where there was a young man who was fitting these rubber molding around the drip rails. And I said to him, you know, I've got a problem with these things. They never seem to fit properly. He never said a word to me. But the next car that came along, he took one of the drip rails out of his stock of spares, put it on there, fitted it very carefully to the front, ran it all the way around to the back, hammered it in, got to the back end, there was a gap, like about that, the back end. Next car comes through, he fits it at the back, runs it all around to the front. So the gap at the front was now about that. Next car came through, and I'm thinking all these customers are going to get these cars. The next car came through, and he carefully fitted it right in the middle, knowing where it was, having had a lot of experience, and ran it around the back, ran it around the front, and so the gap was about half what it was, but it was at the front and the back of this whole thing. And I looked at him and I said, well, you know, what's the problem? Why don't we just get new drip moldings that would fit properly? And he pointed to a box above his head. Well, there must have been thousands of these things. You know, and it's a story, but unfortunately, it's sort of indicative of the problem that British Leyland made and, or had in building the Spitfire. Just poor engineering, poor design going in, and that's the kind of thing, if you know anything about, you know, the Japanese auto industry and how they do it, and how they integrate everything from the very beginning, why they don't end up with problems like drip railings on a TR7. We were just locked into various things on it, locked into the transmission, locked into the rear axle. The engine was pretty good. The componentry just didn't fit the way it should, simply because there was not enough engineering put into it in the beginning. Why? They didn't have the people. That was fundamentally it. They were short-staffed, and they were trying to make money quickly. And consequently, we ended up with a car that we, as the manufacturer, certainly were not as proud of as we would have liked to have been. And then I think we further compounded it by creating one of the great advertising sins, or replicating it. A wonderful man by the name of Bill Bernbach, who was the Bernbach of Leyland and Bernbach, once said that the fastest way to kill a bad product is with good advertising. And I think the advertising that we did at that period of time, bringing that car in from the land of British racing green, bringing it in as one of the new, hopefully not endangered species, and then making it the shape of things to come, I think was one of the most brilliant pieces of advertising that the company ever came up with. And I think it did, you know, a pretty good job, but unfortunately the product didn't quite live up to the expectations that we created, and that's the kiss of death. That really is. Fortunately, I mean, the company eventually rectified a lot of those problems, but as we all know, I mean, there are so many orphan cars out there that we can mention, cars like, I mean, even Fiat, as we see now, still there is that residual of fix it again, Tony. You know, they've got to overcome that. Renault hasn't figured out a way of doing it. They'd love to come into this marketplace again, but they know that they come in, they're going to be savaged because of the reputation of the products like the Dauphine and Echo that really have hurt them to the present. So, with that, I would like to throw it open to any questions that you might have, and I'll do my best to see if I can answer them. Yes, sir.
When you watch Mad Men on television, there's always a lot of drinking that goes on in the office. Is that true to life? Did you guys have booze in the office in every executive's office? And,
every lunchtime?
I'm going to make this sort of a disclaimer. I mean, Mad Men I know I've been in the business a long time, but Mad Men was in the period of time just before I really got involved in the advertising side. So if it did exist, I really didn't see that much. I don't think any more of that than I might have seen at a Merrill Lynch, Pierce Finner, and Bean or Smith, or at a UPS. There were certain people who knew how to bottle someplace. We had a copywriter at Doyle Dane who was the only man who could write advertising copy. I mean, for radio. Nobody wanted to do that. That was kind of one of those gut jobs. Nobody wanted to do it. George was a great radio copy man. But you had to get George before lunch. Because after lunch, he was downstairs and it was hopeless. Now, were there people having sex upon the desk? Not to my knowledge, no. But I can say I do know somebody that had sex in a porch bin at British Leyland. I don't know how comfortable it could have been. So to answer your question, I think, and the other thing that absolutely, I watched one episode where Don Draper, the account is hanging by a thread. And they had this meeting with the client. And Don Draper, who's this great creative genius, in the midst of the meeting, comes up with the idea that saves the account. I don't think so. I mean, great advertising generally, in my experience, is the product of 2 or 3 or 4 people who work very hard. You put an art director together with a copywriter, and they, with input from whoever the account person is, the account person working with the objectives and strategy, the art director understanding what you're trying to achieve, a copywriter coming up and coming up with the graphic, the picture that's going to really, sell the message, as with the shape of things that come to come, and the copywriter, and they put it all together. And the gestation period is weeks, not in an instant at a meeting, and certainly not in front of the client. I mean, first of all, you don't want to admit that you're badly prepared anyhow. So we did some horrendous things to ensure that the client didn't know that the ads literally were coming in over the transom as we spoke, and I've had that happen on occasion. But for the most part, I mean, the creative process is a lot more disciplined than people give it credit for. 2 examples. In my lifetime, I've been lucky to meet 2 of the real geniuses in advertising, one being Bill Bernbach and the other being David Ogilvy. And David Ogilvy, best known for, at 60 miles an hour, the loudest you use the clock. What little is known about David started out, not as a copywriter, he started out in research. And he really wanted to know an awful lot about the product before he actually started to write copy. The discipline that I saw at Doyle Dane was similar in that regard. Bill Bernbach was one of the great all-time copywriters. I mean, he's Copywriter Hall of Fame, Advertising Hall of Fame, everything. One of my jobs as the management supervisor on the Porsche and Audi business was, I would have to present to Bill Bernbach every new campaign. Not every ad, but if you were going to be doing a new campaign, fundamentally changing the direction of the advertising, it was the responsibility of the management supervisor, the account person, not the creative people, but the account person, to go in and present that campaign to Bill Bernbach. And of course, they didn't tell me this when they hired me, but that's another story. I mean, it's very intimidating when you're dealing with somebody who's an acknowledged genius in the field. But I carried an Audi campaign, and one that we weren't particularly thrilled with. But it was a campaign that the client had a lot of direction in. And even before I started to show the ads to Bill, he said to me, no, not yet. What are the objectives? So I had to go through the objectives with him. He He said, okay, what's the strategy? So I had to go through the strategy with him. And when I finished with that, he said, okay, now show me the ads. So I showed him the ads. And I love this comment on it. And he looked at it and he said, well, they are rather obvious, aren't they? And I said, yes, they are. And he said, what do you think the client's going to do? And I said, the client will like it, because he had so much direction. And the client in this particular case was Jim Fuller. And he had remembered the previous Audi campaign, which we called the Engineers campaign at Doyle Dane. Some of you might, I don't think anybody's that old, but some of you might remember the first version of what we called the Engineers campaign. There was one ad in particular that struck an awful lot of people, and usually the wrong way. There was a German engineer, she was a female engineer, I think she was in suspensions or something like that, but she was standing in the ad with her legs akimbo, short skirt, long black boots. I mean, it was like out of a bad World War II movie. All she was missing was the wit. And I mean, it was sad. It was just the way it was presented. But the Engineers campaign was very, very technically oriented, and it projected, it unfortunately projected the engineers in the way a lot of us thought about the German engineers. Very autocratic. I mentioned in the book something, that most engineers think that if they're not God, they're right next to him. And the German engineers were no different on this sort of thing. Well, Jim liked the concept of getting the German engineering across, but he wanted it done in a softer, less hostile way, less aggressive way. So we did come up with a way of handling it, and it was a relatively effective campaign. I mean, it helped to launch the Audi 5000 at the time. It was a relatively successful launch. Audi Quattro, we launched at that time, also relatively successful. But it was not the kind of campaign that says this is great advertising. It was very workmanlike. And Bill recognized it as such.
So does the same campaign get used in America as in Europe, or is there a whole different campaign by different people?
Generally, there were different campaigns. There was always the desire on the part of the factory for us to use European advertising.
British Leyland the same?
Tried very hard. And we kept saying, well, two things wrong with that. We are your volume market. We should be driving it, if anything. And number two, look at the different ranges of vehicles. I mean, Triumph's a super example of that. There wasn't really any successful Triumph sedan in this marketplace, was there? I mean, some we sold, some kind of drifted into the marketplace and then drifted out. We were focused on sports cars. It had an entirely different image here than it had in the UK. So to say that you could use the same kind of approach didn't make sense. And then, of course, they would compound it as Ford did by saying, okay, what we're going to do is put our design studio in California, because that's where the trend for design is coming from. And we'd say, there's a disconnect here. You're putting your design studio in California because you think that's where the trends are, and yet you want your advertising to come out of England? No, it doesn't make sense. So I think, essentially, one of the first things I was able to do when I went to BMC was to get them to produce their brochures in the United States. That was like a great step forward. But we made it work simply because, and this is, I think, one of our strengths, which eventually we incorporated into Triumph too. If you look at that period of Atlanta British Racing Green, that reflects, you see a lot of that reflected in the brochures. And we said there's a huge synergy between the way we produce sales promotion material and the advertising. And then there's continuity. And even though you don't have big budgets, it's a way of capitalizing on whatever you're doing. So don't go off in one direction and then go off in a different direction. Didn't make sense. So we fought that through and did win. And I'm very grateful for the U.S. management, because I think they saw the wisdom of that. And the U.S. management, for the most part, was great. There was a comment I wanted to make about, just one, I'll remember this, but people have asked me, what's the difference between working for a British company and working for an American company? And, I mean, the great thing is we are, two great countries separated by the same language, which George Bernard Shaw said, or Oscar Wilde said, or Winston Churchill probably said, and if he didn't, he should have. But it's really true. I mean, we tend to think of ourselves as, very, very close to the Brits in terms of thinking. The reality is, my experience, they're European, and we're American, and we think differently, we act differently. And if you want a one-word description, it's in the word yes. If I were to, when I came in and said, Bob, I want you to move this podium over there, and Bob would say yes. And I'd disappear, and he'd disappear, and I'd come back, and the podium would be over there. Well, if I did that to a Brit, I'd come back, the podium would still be here. And this is not meant as a criticism, it's just, we think in different planes.
That's because you didn't say please.
Or I could use some other words that might have been. No, it's not so much that. It's that when a Brit says yes to a question like that, it doesn't mean he's going to do anything about it. It simply means he understood what you were saying. You have to then take it to the next step, which is, well, are you going to move it? Or will you have it moved? And if they say yes, they'll do that. And I know it sounds funny, but it's true. And I have to say, I found this, first of all, I found it very true working with the Brits, because I was working with them as the client, much closer than you do as the agency. But I also found it not all that different working with the Germans. They too have a European mentality. Yes simply means they understand the question. You then have to take them to the next stage. You're going to do something about it. Sure.
Yeah, what could you tell us about the endangered species shoots and creating those ads?
They were all done in the UK, amazingly enough. I mean, there are a lot of things that you can find in the UK if you look around for them. And what we did was find a place in the UK which was essentially a game preserve. But a lot of it was done through the magic of retouching. The cats were never as close to the car as what we showed in these pictures. But there again is a good example of what I'm talking about. I was on the endangered species shoot, and we had set up, we had photographers, we had everything set up. And I arrived there on a Friday to pick up the two cars, the two hero cars, BRG TR6 and the BRG Spit. And I got the TR6, but they didn't have the Spitfire. So I said, where's my Spitfire? And they said, well, we don't have one right now. We'll get you one next week. I said, wait a second. Guys, I got a photographer, I've got an art director, I've got a copywriter, I got a cast of thousands. And this is the weekend we want to shoot. And the response was, ooh, that's going to be difficult. We don't have one. Okay, let's think about it for a while. What can we do to get one very quickly? And they suggested that I, not them, that I go down to the first floor. And this is another way I describe it. There is the second floor and the first floor. The first floor is basically where the assembly line is. That's where things happen. The second floor is where management is. And the two never meet. I mean, they just don't touch each other. So management said to me, well, go down to the methods build. Now, methods build is, they use it for pre-production cars, they use it for specialty cars, whatever. It's essentially, it's a miniature assembly line. It may have 30 or 40 people in it. Yeah. Well, the animals weren't all that close, as I said, but that was the car. So they sent me down to methods build, and they said, go down there. And I went down there, found the foreman, and I said, can you make me a Spitfire? And he said, yes. And I said, I want a Spitfire, I want a BRG. When can you do it? And he looked at me and said, when do you need it? I said, I really need it this afternoon. And he looked around and he said, you think we can do that? And the response was, for those people, yeah, they could do it. And they did. And it was a question that nobody had ever asked them before. course, I did all those other things. Queen's Award to Industry, you know, the Queen will bless you for this, all the rest of that stuff, and really tried to get them ginned up on it. That, and we agreed to meet at the pub after the car was completed. But it was the difference, again, of our style versus their style. Somehow or another, it had fallen through the cracks, getting that car produced. But it was not impossible if you asked the right people and you did it in the right way. And so I'm not going to be, I'm not a critic of English labor. I think English labor, unfortunately, has been stigmatized by a lot of very bad management decisions, and by this separation, if you will, this gulf that does exist. And I was stunned to read something about that in, I guess, the Parade magazine, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, where the co-creator of Downton Abbey was quoting a survey done by the Labour government. Now, let us say that that's not exactly the most impartial group of people to do surveys. But the survey came back saying one of the things that was the greatest, you know, inhibiting factor, one of the strongest inhibiting factors in the growth of British industry was an effect that this class system still exists. I mean, he phrased it much more delicately than I'm doing. But I think there was a lot of validity in what he said. And I think you'll find, you know, that unfortunately, while it's not as true as it used to be, there's still a lot of that there. There's still a lot of noblesse oblige. There's still a lot of that to the manner born. And, you know, it's changing, but right now, it's still a factor. And obviously, it's a factor to the point that the British government thinks something needs to be done about it.
Any other questions for Bob?
Yes?
Yeah.
In your experience, did you ever buy or own a British car, and how long was it before it broke down on you?
Yes, I actually did. I bought an MGB. Well, yeah, and it never broke down on me. In fact, the only company car that I ever had break down on me